A very good afternoon, distinguished guest speakers, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Vani, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. On behalf of the Energy Studies Institute and the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, I welcome you to the panel discussion on sustainable energy transition in South Asia, trends, implications, and opportunities, which will be followed by the launch of the publication on sustainable energy transition in South Asia, challenges and opportunities. I would like to first invite Dr. Amitendra Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economics, ISAS NUS, to deliver the welcome remarks. Dr. Palit, please.
Thank you, Vani, and friends and colleagues. Delighted to welcome you all to today's book launch and panel discussion. This is, in many respects, a bit of a unique occasion, not just because it's an excellent example of neighborhood cooperation. As some of you might be knowing, ISAS and ESI are located right next to each other within the same premises. But notwithstanding such proximity, cooperation is not always visible among neighbors. So we are very glad that this is actually a cooperation which is visible, and hopefully it is the beginning of more such partnerships. The second is that this is also a rare occasion when we have a discussion which is going to combine the depth and breadth of the expertise that we have across the energy sector, but coming out from perspectives from two different institutes. ISA is the Institute of South Asian Studies, as some of you might be knowing, is a multidisciplinary area studies institute covering verticals like policy, politics, governance, trade, economics, international relations, and strategic issues, whereas the Energy Studies Institute has a vast reservoir of experience and expertise on various aspects of energy and issues connected to energy. It is very interesting as to when these two institutes bring in their perspectives, as they did at a workshop which was organized roughly 2 years ago jointly by these two institutes, convening a set of papers on subjects that cut across two regions, South Asia and Southeast Asia, and to harness the experiences and perspectives that came out of those papers. We have a product which is fairly unique by itself. In fact, I am not aware of many such books or productions, academic productions that have been done, which bring in the subject of sustainability in the context of energy across these two regions of the world, as they have in this book. And I think in that respect, we have an excellent discussion to look forward to, and of course, an excellent book to read as well, provided you pick those up at, I think, the amazingly discounted price at which they are available outside. So having said that, on behalf of ISAS, on behalf of ESI, on behalf of my very distinguished colleagues, Dr. Philip Andrew Speed, Dr. Christopher Len, Dr. S. Narayan, and everybody else from the two institutes, I take this pleasure again to welcome you all to today's discussion. Hope you enjoy the discussions and stay in touch. Thank you, Vani.
We will now proceed to the panel discussion, and I would like to invite the following speakers on stage. First will be Dr. S. Narayan, visiting Senior Research Fellow, ISAS NUS, and former Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister of India. Mr. Shiva Sursala, Founder Director, Reenergy Asia. Mr. Peter Godfrey, Managing Director, Asia Pacific Energy Institute. Moderating the session is Dr. Philip Andrew Speed, Senior Principal Fellow and Head of Energy Security Division from ESI NUS. And I now hand over the floor to Dr. Andrew Speed.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As someone who specializes in China, it's great to see people working on South Asian energy. We're all saturated with good news and bad news of China's energy sector, and so I think it's time that we and many others started to focus more and produce much more informed research on South Asia. So this, I won't say this is a start, but at least in this building, the book and the panel discussion are a start in that respect. So I'll ask first, each of the panelists have 10 minutes minutes to present some ideas, and then we will open the floor for discussion for another half an hour. Dr. Narayan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I come from a background of more of energy policy and financial policy making. So my comments would be on this topic of sustainable energy, limited to kind of the policy options that the South Asian countries are facing and how they are proposing to tackle it. And I'll just deal with, in the 10 minutes available, I'll just deal with two issues here, because it's very complex and very big issue. One is the issue of sustainable energy transition. The word transition means you're going to move from a current position of unsustainable energy management to somewhere where some kind of a sustainable development and management of energy takes place, if you take a very, very broad view of that particular sentence. So where are the options? First, you can't ignore fossil fuels. And all the South Asian countries, the import dependence on fossil fuels, particularly petroleum and gas projects, is 80% and growing. And as these countries are developing, really the South Asian countries together are growing at a rate of 6% and above. I mean, okay, Pakistan is growing a little less, but if you take an average of 6% and above, the energy use is going to grow substantially. And currently, the energy use increase is coming from consumption of coal as well as consumption of fossil fuels. So how does this get changed? I think briefly, if you look at fossil fuels, so long as the transportation industry continues to depend heavily on petroleum and petroleum products, it's going to be very difficult to reduce the use of transportation, petroleum fuels for transportation. The electric cars and or whatever may deal with personal transportation, but we cannot deal with issues like rail transportation, cannot deal with issues like air transportation, cannot deal with issues like ship transportation as yet. Maybe something will happen in the future. So any transition to electric vehicles, any transition to non-fossil fuels is going to be limited in the next decade or so. One. Two, issue of coal. Coal generation in South Asian countries is close to about 10%, close to about 50% of the total generation. And the generation requirements will increase as the countries keep growing. Interestingly, while India has just now committed itself to limiting the growth of coal, in fact, they've said they'll come down to 40% total generation in coal, and they have announced a huge solar program, which is, I don't know whether it's doable or not. But if you see Bangladesh and Pakistan, you'd see more and more coal-based power stations coming up. And this is coming up, interestingly, due to the China Belt and Road Initiative, which is pumping in a lot of money into coal-based stations in these two countries. So while it's not growing coal-based stations in its own country, it's growing coal-based stations all along the Belt and Road. Okay. I don't think we have done an analysis of how much addition to emissions that this kind of a policy initiative is creating. And I think it's very, very important for both Pakistan and Bangladesh especially to start looking at what is the result of this. Three, all the South Asian countries have coal-based stations which are extremely old. So there's a great opportunity in modernizing them and improving the process efficiency of these stations by modernizing them to reduce not only coal consumption, but also emissions, and also to produce much more energy out of existing stations. Okay. So this is, again, an opportunity. But it requires investment. If I wear the finance hat, I would like to argue that, okay, where do I put our money in? Would I put our money in enlarging energy availability or improving energy efficiency? And I'm sure that this would differ from geographic location to location. On renewable energy, one more point on hydro energy, a lot is being done in South Asia. Recently, there has been a good agreement between Bhutan and India, India and Bangladesh, Northeast India and Bangladesh, where a lot of hydro energy resources are available, and I would say trade of energy, I would say renewable energy, hydro energy, is possible and is likely to grow, which I think is a very, very good alternative. On solar and wind, India is growing extremely fast. Not so much Pakistan and Bangladesh. India is growing extremely fast. But there is a huge mismatch between the price of fuel, the price of power generated by sustainable energy stations and from the old coal-based stations. So what do you do? Again, a policy question, because solar power is available today at about 2.5 rupees. I mean, if you a unit, a kilowatt hour, whereas coal power is costing almost double that. So what do? Do you take down all the coal power stations? Do you average out the cost of coal? I think these are kind of economic and not just, and also environmental issues. Do you put a price on the coal base which will make it even higher? That means the opportunity of closing down those stations even becomes much more attractive. So I think these are kind of policy paradigms that these South Asian countries are currently battling with, and each of these countries is coming up with different solutions, and a kind of lot of research is necessary to analyze this alternative, and in fact to look at which is more suitable. I think not adequate research is available in this. Lastly, in my 2-3 minutes left, what is going to be the role of fossil fuels in the next decade? I don't think fossil fuels are going to go away, but fossil fuels in South Asia use of fossil fuels is going to be limited, not just by economic development, by environmental concerns, but purely as a matter of price and availability. We have seen prices go up in the last 1 month by almost 15-20% in terms of petroleum, but we have seen natural gas prices almost flat for the last 6 months. In fact, natural gas prices are falling. But can a country take policy decisions, long-term policy decisions, based on these intermittent price changes? I think this is going to be a challenge that all these countries would have to face, and these countries would continue to depend on these imports. So what do you import? Would you import more of oil, or would you import more of gas? In which case you have to change your infrastructure considerably to meet these challenges. I think these are the kind of policy questions that South Asia is facing, and different countries would tackle them differently. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Okay, Mr. Shiva Surlava.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. I used to work at ESI. My ex-boss is seated right here. So ESI is coming back. It's like a homecoming for me, and a pleasure to be seated with this distinguished panel. Thank you, Philip. Thanks, Dr. Narayanan, for setting the context. My background, I've spent a decade in the renewables, clean tech, energy efficiency, innovation, and now even in the electric mobility space from an innovation advisory research perspective. So you won't find a stronger proponent or supporter of votary to transition to a clean energy system in South Asia. Having said that, and I know the topic today is sustainable energy transitions, having said that, for the foreseeable future, and we're talking the next 2 decades, 3 decades, up to 2050, 2060, what South Asia and South Asians need is access to the most affordable, the most reliable, and the most accessible fuel sources. If that is also clean energy, great. If that is not clean energy, then for a region that's trying to transition from a lower income to a upper middle income type of situation, it is probably a wrong prescription to force fit a more expensive, perhaps unreliable source of energy into the context, right? So will there be a continued dependence on fossils for the next 2 or 3 decades? Yes. But where will that dependence come from, in my view? I think the power generation sector is dramatically changing. Dr. Narayanan also already pointed out the cost advantages, and I'll come to that. But there's a lot of fossils that go into the industrial sector, into agriculture, into transportation, and these sectors are key for the South Asian region to achieve their goals of getting to a middle income situation. So I don't see an alternative to core dependence on fossils in the next 2 or 3 decades. Having said that, South Asia, and particularly India, we've seen a massive deployment in terms of growth rates of solar and wind in the last 10 years. Especially in the last 7 years, it's accelerated really, really fast. In 2009, late 2009, when I got into the sector, India had about, I think, 300 megawatt of solar utility scale. Today, it's a 30 gigawatt. And this has happened in a decade. So if you see the scale of deployment, the rate of growth, it's, I think, 1,000 times, right? It's massive just in 10 years. Wind was about 800 megawatt, and today it's about 36 gigawatt, I believe. So again, really, really rapid deployment. What is the secret? Is it just cost? Let's look at it from an investor perspective, right? Almost together, let's say about $80 to $100 billion has gone in the last decade in this sector. What has given investors the courage to put money at such a rapid scale of deployment? 2-3 things. Remember the first rule of investment, right? And again, my ex-boss just couldn't stop pointing out to us when we did research at ESI at that time. Investment is a function of 2 variables, risk and return. What the government did in South Asia, right, particularly India about a decade ago, is they systematically addressed a lot of risks associated with renewables. And they didn't do the same for the fossil fuel sector. Think about a typical coal-fired power plant, right? Setting up in a region like South Asia. You have to get first a fuel supply agreement. Very, very tricky. Takes a year minimum to negotiate and lock in. And you're locking in at a formula. You don't get a fixed price. At best, you get an index. And it's a formula that varies. On the basis of this fuel supply agreement, you have to negotiate a PPA with some off-taker. That negotiation takes a couple of years, at least. Pass-through contract, can you pass on the increase or decrease in the fuel prices, negotiate ceilings, negotiate floors, what happens on payment terms, all these take about 2 to 3 years to negotiate. And then you close the financial decision, and then you start investing and building. We are looking at a 3 to 5 year time lag from project plan to actually commissioning. In the renewable sector, the government actually stepped in and said, hey, we want renewables, and therefore we are eliminating a lot of the risk. We are eliminating operational risk. We are giving you a fixed tariff. We are assuring you offtake of all the energy that you produce for 25 years, right? Hey, land purchase is a problem. We'll create like a SEZ, what they call solar parks. It's like an SEZ for solar. We will buy land on your behalf and make it easy for you to get land clearances. In fact, most recent big power projects in India, the solar ones, are plug-and-play model. The government readies everything else. All you need to do is to go deploy. And the price is negotiated on that basis. The government systematically addressed a lot of risks associated with renewables. This left investors and project developers with technology risk and some amount of operational risk, which is anyway very low in renewables. To me, that is probably the single biggest factor that really catalyzed the growth of the renewable sector in South Asia. It also helped that for the balance of plant, right? A lot of inverters, components. There was international suppliers actually announced India-specific pricing, to lower the cost in pursuit of volumes. So that also helped to sort of lower the cost. And as of today, India offers the lowest deployment cost for solar globally, right? And this has happened because the government addressed a lot of risks. So if you see ASEAN, right, the renewables sector hasn't really taken off. There's barely any solar deployment. There's barely any wind. And that's because they focused on a high FIT but very, very limited capacity allocation. They didn't take away some of the best practices from India and other regions, in my view. So that, to me, explains the dramatic rise. Now, as of today, the South Asian power sector is in a spot of bother. They're debt-ridden. Payments are delayed. The power industry is debt-ridden, right? Developers are debt-ridden. They're unable to pay their cash flows. Capacity utilizations are low, particularly for fossil power plants. So they are struggling to pay their debt. They're in for a lot of pain. We just had very recently, a couple of months back, one big province in India, one state saying, hey, we want to renegotiate all the solar and wind projects that we've issued PPAs for. If they manage to get their way, I foresee a domino effect where everyone says we want to negotiate, right? TLDR, cutting a long story short, I see a lot of pain for the South Asian power sector, especially the Indian power sector, both fossils as well as renewables in the short term. In the long term, I see a more modest deployment. I believe that the renewable power developers will have to assume a lot more risk compared to the last decade. I think PPA structures are going to change. They will be penalized for supplying power when the grid doesn't need it, right? And they'll probably be incentivized to supply when the grid needs it more, especially during peak hours. So I see PPA structures changing significantly. Storage is going to play a very, very big role in this transition. And then the single biggest roadblock I see, and I can discuss further if there are questions, is the DISCOMs, the distribution companies in India. To me, they are the single biggest roadblock in the transition to a sustainable, cleaner, smarter energy system. They are monopolies. They're invested in systems of the old, systems of the past. They are in terrible financial shape. They are in no position to make any new investments. And because of the nature of how they are sort of structured, at the mercy of political players and at the mercy of political agendas, I actually see the DISCOMs being the biggest barriers to a sustainable energy transition. So for new investors into the space, they'll be looking at greater risk of solar power projects and wind power, but it's a more mature sector now. People understand the risks better. But what is going to drive the 300 gigawatt solar goal or the 500 gigawatt wind goal? And these are not small numbers because the Indian installed capacity today is about 350, 400 gigawatts, right? So if you're looking at 300 gigawatt of only solar, you're probably talking about a massive penetration level, right? So the biggest risk I see is the reform of the DISCOMs. That's going to be the key to new investments, new transition, and new energy in South Asia with a focus on India. Thank you.
Peter, go.
Yes, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Philip. Philip and I come from a similar background. I come from an oil and gas background originally. We both worked for BP many years ago. My last job with BP was actually heading up BP in Indonesia. I now represent the Energy Institute of the UK with a bigger brief, so not just talking about oil and gas, but very much talking about the circular economy, green energy, clean energy, and where we go from here. So what I'm going to talk about really is to really summarize the two speakers beforehand, but really from a global perspective, try to put in what I think are some of the key issues that we should be considering, not only from the point of view of Southeast Asia and South Asia, but also from the point of view of the globe. And I start from one simple premise. Both speakers really talked about policy and the fact that we still have crazy mixed up policies when it comes to the whole issue of what we mean by clean and green energy and where we take this. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of what we think of in terms of a policy. Today we hear Greta, we hear what's happening in the United Nations generally around climate change, climate action as being core issues. Decarbonization has been very much the focus within the energy world. Energy efficiency is something we hear time and time again. I'm going to start my argument by saying these are not the only things that matter. In fact, the most important thing that matters is the fact that we really struggle with the fact that we don't know how the world will provide energy, food, water for the generations when we're talking about 10 billion people on this earth in 2050. That's 30% more people than we are today. The issue is how we use our resources more efficiently. It doesn't matter whether they're oil, gas, coal, anything else. We need to find a way to actually use our resources more effectively and more efficiently. Now, the good news when it comes to resource efficiency is a recognition that today's technologies allow us to do things very differently to the past. And I come back to the energy industry and energy policy and make a very bold statement about Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Europe, the US, and say that the policies of today are based on an industry structure that was created 100+ years ago, at the beginning of the oil and gas industry, based on the technologies that existed in those days. The supply chains that we've created, moving oil and gas thousands of miles to markets, are inefficient in today's world. There is an easy way to begin to start cleaning up that act by beginning to start using stakeholders to look at the whole issue of resource efficiency in a different way. I agree with Narayan. I agree when he talks about coal. If you're sitting in Indonesia on top of a coal mine, or in northern India on top of a coal mine, why not use that coal as long as you can clean it up? Likewise, if the sun is shining, use as much solar power as you can use. But the issue is all about efficiency. It's creating a new efficient system. And today, if we look at any energy system within the world, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in India, whether it's in Bangladesh or Indonesia, nobody would create the energy system as it looks today if they had a clean sheet of paper. The answer is how we create a set of policies that will move us from an energy system framework of yesterday into an energy system framework of tomorrow. Now, what are the core factors that actually make this good news? Because I'm actually an optimist. I think we can change those energy system architectures today for a simple reason, and there are actually 4 good reasons why this can happen. One of which is, in the past, we were in a world where economic growth and energy were basically the same thing. If you wanted to create economic growth, you needed more energy. Actually, we're now finding that there is a disconnect. That actually, if you begin to start using resources, we can actually reduce energy intensity against GDP. We can also recognize that today we have energy efficiency technologies, whether it be with vehicles or whether it be in transportation and advanced transportation, that take us to energy efficiency levels that we've never experienced before. And by the way, if you look at hydrocarbon molecules coming out of the ground today, which we mine or dig out as oil and gas, today, under our current energy system, less than 20% of those molecules turns into useful energy, back to resource efficiency. How can we live in a world where only 20% of the resources that we're digging out of the ground actually turn into anything useful? We have technologies that will allow us to do much better things than that. Renewables help us, and renewable technologies are clearly part of the equation, but at the end of the day, it's all about electrification. Electrification is the core technology that will drive the future. I have spoken to oil and gas companies who say, oh yeah, but gas is very useful. Oil is still, yeah, very useful within an electrified world. They are, and they continue to be useful. But at the end of the day, it's all about creating electricity closer to the market. And you use the resources that are most efficient, whether they be renewables, whether they be coal, whether they be gas, to produce that energy in the most efficient way, but from a resource efficiency perspective. So my stance is very much around saying that we should be focusing on resource efficiency. And to do that, from a policy perspective, there are two core focus areas we must consider. One of which is that in that world of electrification, the idea of centralized energy policies run by state-owned organizations is no longer valid. Decentralization and democratization of energy is fundamental to be creating the efficient advantages that we need in the future. And Asia must wake up to the fact that the old days of state-owned entities running the energy system of the future is no longer viable in tomorrow's world. Technologies are moving us into a completely different direction. The second issue is a recognition that policy needs to be decentralized, it needs to be regional. National energy policy is no longer valid when you're thinking about resource efficiency at a more localized level. And the third and final issue is an issue around pricing and value. Value is about understanding that in today's world, being more resource efficient, be more environmentally sustainable, are parts of what we constitute of value. Price and value, when it comes to commodities, have gone out of alignment with each other. We are paying prices for a value chain, as I said before, that is 100+ years old. We need to move to a value chain which indicates pricing much more in alignment with what we see today as being value. So creating that alignment of value also means we need a differential pricing policy. There is no single price for energy. The value that a village in the jungle pays for its energy cannot be the same price as a person who is air conditioning their third home in Malibu or wherever it might be. We need to think about different policies, different structures in order to move forwards. Thank you.
So we've had a variety of perspectives. Dr. Narayan gave us the view of the complex policy challenges across South Asia and the fact that they vary between country and country. Shiva, along with Narayan, agreed that the fossil fuels are going to be with us for some time. He was getting severely optimistic about India, then it says it's all going to crash. And in fact, when you spoke about the PPAs and the feed-in tariffs, I wrote down affordability question mark, and clearly you're saying, well, some of the provinces are renegotiating. So yes, think of Spain. And we've heard a slightly different focus on energy efficiency or resource efficiency along the whole supply chain. from Peter, and that fits in very much with the International Energy Agency's graph that showed the biggest chunk in the curve towards reducing carbon emissions. The biggest chunk lies with energy efficiency, but Peter's taken it further to look at resource efficiency. So I open the floor to questions and comments from the floor, and there will be somebody with a microphone, so please raise your hand, and then when you get the microphone, please give us your name and institution. And you may comment directly on what speakers have said or what they haven't said. So do not feel constrained. Yes, madam.
Hello, my name is Ira. I'm from the Energy Studies Institute. First of all, thank you to all the panelists for really interesting presentations. My question is actually more for Peter at this point. I just want to pick up on what you said about democratization and decentralization of energy and other resources to make it more efficient.
Can you put your microphone a bit? That's it.
Yeah. How do you, like, if this future is imminent, how would you see the role of policymaking in the future? I mean, what would then be the most efficient policymaking at what level? If the national level is no longer efficient, as you say, are you saying that it will be local? Or if not, are you saying that we won't be needing any sort of policymaking in the future in the context of energy, but also more broadly? Thank you.
Very good question. Thank you very much. I guess, there is no silver bullet. The issue here for me is very much about multi-stakeholder conversation. It is about governments engaging with local communities and local governments in order to come up with these solutions. But also tied in with this is industry itself. There is a recognition that we have, obviously, the green industry, the renewables industries working behind the scenes. But I'm very much of the opinion that unless we engage the national oil companies and the majors and their balance sheets in actually sorting out the resource efficiency, energy efficiency problem going forwards, we're not going to achieve very much. Because at the end of the day, that is still where the wealth is, and that is still where the wealth resides. So to me, we have to start a conversation around a transition towards a more democratized model going forwards. It's not a quick fix. It is a set of conversations. Now, what can we do about this? Well, I think there's some very simple steps back to resource efficiency. So, for example, within the oil industry today, the bulk of money that the oil industry makes today comes out of the number of molecules they take out of the ground. Today, they have no responsibility from a policy perspective in actually how efficiently those resources are used. This goes beyond decarbonization. This goes to the point that molecules make money for the oil and gas industry. That has to change. So that's where I would start. How do we change the oil and gas and coal business and resources industries to industries who themselves are incentivized to become more resource efficient? That's where I'd start.
I'll fill in this gap for the moment and look at Dr. Narayan. You hinted at the issue of interstate collaboration in energy transport, and it's a topic that is addressed quite a lot in the book that is about to be launched. And I'd wonder if you'd like to tell us a bit of the narrative in the last 2 or 3 years, whether things are moving forward with energy cooperation in South Asia, because this is a real opportunity to be both efficient and clean.
I do think if you look at South Asia, there are opportunities and there are barriers. One big barrier to energy cooperation is, of course, the India-Pakistan problem, which is a problem of politics, of security, whatever you call it. Otherwise, enormous benefits to both countries economically in terms of energy efficiency would be possible because a lot of energy generation in India takes place on the Western Corridor, which could easily be shared with Pakistan. So here is a huge lost opportunity because of politics. Opportunities are opening up in the east with Bangladesh, especially because of the huge hydro potential that is getting generated from Sikkim and in Assam and Eastern, which could easily flow into Bangladesh and provide, I would say, sustainable, alternative, cheaper energy to them. And because of a, I would say, particularly skewed consumption of energy, where the eastern part of India is actually consuming less energy than what Bangladesh is requiring. So there's a huge opportunity there, not only for trading energy, but also efficient and sustainable trading of energy. Opportunities from Nepal, again, a large hydro potential which is moving in, and which can move into north and west of India, where there's a huge demand. So in the last 1 year, we have seen a lot of these issues getting understood. I used to underline the word understood, much more fundamentally than they were even for the last 5 or 6 years. And transmission and, what shall I say, logistic lines getting drawn in a manner where use of energy is slowly becoming more efficient. For example, the southern part of India uses its enormous requirements of energy are much more than the central part of India. So you have a lot of transmission lines coming down to the central part of India. And in terms of pricing, the best thing that has happened in India is the creation of an energy exchange where one can buy and sell energy. Up to today, it is only overnight or for 2 days, but the energy efficient is starting to work efficiently. The moment you can buy energy and you have transmission lines 1 week in advance, or then automatically the stations which are inefficient have to back off. And the stations which are efficient start contributing at a price which is reasonable for the buyer, which means the best price. I think this is, to my mind, the last 3 or 4 years is one of the best things, that you allow the market to operate in terms of pricing. I think this is something very good that's happening.
Thank you. The floor is open for comments. Yes, madam, in the back row. The microphone is coming.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Bhavya, and I'm an independent consultant. My question is with regards to the fact that there is a lot of energy transition going on right now, and traditionally oil and gas have been believed to be very geopolitically motivated. How do you see this clean energy transition impacting geopolitics? We see that China is a leading manufacturer of solar modules, and India kind of depends a lot on Chinese solar modules for our power generation capacity. So solar modules also happen to be a key commodity within the US-China trade war. So US decided to implement that tariff, whereas India shied away from implementing it on a heavy basis. So what do you see, countries prioritizing their energy goals or the geopolitical developments? How do you think this is going to impact geopolitical developments?
So the global geopolitics of the energy transition. Why don't I will point it at ex-government minister or ministerial official, see what he says.
Very, very good question. But you must understand, whole of South Asia is 80-85% dependent on imported fossil fuels. That includes coal. And this dependence is going to continue for the next 10 or 15 years. So if at all one were looking at a country's balance sheet, the first question would be, can I continue to afford importing this quantity of energy? And the entire economic fabric then revolves around this. If I cannot keep my transportation wheels moving, if I cannot keep my logistics wheels moving, if I cannot have the money to import energy, then I am in serious problem. And this is not solar versus power, because I'm talking of transportation fuels, and transportation fuels run the economy. So unless we go to a level where we say, okay, everything is electrified, in which case, okay, you focus totally on electricity, which means enormous investment in electrification of transportation, question mark. So therefore, I think if you just, I don't know how much you watch what's happening in terms of energy diplomacy in the last 5 or 6 months as far as India is concerned, you would see enormous engagement, especially now with West Asia, particularly in the context of what's happening in Iran, what has just happened in Saudi, etc., just in order to ensure that the oil continues to flow into India. Okay. And therefore, that is box one. Box two is, of course, solar is to grow out of this dependence, particularly dependence on coal. Not so much dependence on oil, because we don't have oil-based power stations. We have a few natural gas-based power stations which are backing off because it's expensive. So if we can increase the generation of solar, as the numbers have pointed out, Mr. Modi has recently said we are talking about 36 gigawatts. He's talked about something like 300 gigawatts in the next 5 to 10 years. Okay. If that really happens, then really the dependence, we would get out of the dependence on these fossil fuels. But dependence on oil will continue. And seriously, we are looking at a number. At what price does oil become totally unaffordable to import? And then we are in serious trouble.
Yeah, just a comment on India and geopolitics. I think sustainability, security of supply is obviously the key issue here. And Asia has been generally focused on security of supply. Why? Because most countries, including India and China, of course, have been resource energy short. Now, the thesis is that over time, as one balances out and has more variations around different energy resources and different solutions to that problem, obviously the security of supply issue potentially begins to recede. So I think, an increased focus on national alliances, interconnectivity, as well as on resource efficiency and a multitude of different options for energy, including nuclear and coal. I'm not discounting any of them, but any of them will eventually create a more secure supply situation. And then, of course, that reduces the geopolitical issue. So I think it is about price signals, as Narayan says. There will be price signals will play into this. But I think there are also policy directives here that people are beginning to flow. So interestingly enough, just days ago, you may have read that US is in the process of inking a deal with India to start a whole clean energy initiative in India. But of course, India is after the US oil and gas from the shale initially. So, there's quite a lot going on behind the scenes in terms of actually moving this into the right direction.
I mean, clearly you were possibly thinking 50 years ahead, in which case, yes, the geopolitics will be different, but that's a different discussion. Yes, sir, in the back row. Microphone, please.
Thank you very much for the panel, for the wonderful presentations. My name is Christian Wagner. I'm a visiting fellow at the moment at the Institute for South Asian Studies. I have a question for Mr. Narayan. One of the Indian prime ministers said that energy supplies also have to be affordable for the Indian population, which brings in the question of pricing. So I would like to know, what is the trend in sustainable energies for the pricing that it really becomes affordable for the majority of the Indian population? Thank you.
Three boxes. Box number one, affordability for what? If it is affordability for consumption, which means you are talking about domestic energy, I think India has moved a very, very, very long way by subsidizing LPG gas, providing some 80 million connections, and taking off the subsidy to all the people who are above a particular line, so that in a way the subsidy is balancing out. I mean, not exactly, but fairly balancing out. That is cooking energy. The electrification of homes, by and large, most states are providing it at very low or almost zero cost and passing the burden on to industry and to commercial use, especially to big city air conditionings. So this is, I would use the box as energy for livelihood. Then you come to the next box, which is, I would say, energy for production. And when you talk about this particular level of people, you're really talking about 300 to 400 million people who are dependent on agriculture. And the energy used in agriculture is primarily for irrigation and for tractors and for agriculture machinery. That's the major part of the energy use. Most states in the country have a dual transmission system which provides for almost free energy for water pumping for of electricity for about 3-4 hours a day, and then they change over at the end of 4 hours. If they want to pump more, they have to pay market prices. And this is now becoming the norm. It started off in Gujarat, now becoming the norm in many states. And that leaves the only other item of energy for agriculture machinery, which is market-based, which is absolutely, I mean, you run a tractor, you run a harvester, you run a plowing machine, you pay market prices for fuel. And this is the way, I'm just telling you what's happening, okay? Is there a better way of doing it? Okay, I don't have answers for that, yeah?
I'm going to pass over Shiva. I mean, in India with the solar PV, or South Asia, you have distributed systems? And in which case, how is that priced? Who pays?
At this point, yeah. So the aggressive targets for distributed systems. Okay, well, there are two categories, right? One is off-grid distributed.
Okay, off-grid. I'm talking about off-grid.
Okay, so and then there's grid connected and yet distributed. So that sector is obviously not moving much. The aggressive targets, 40 gigawatt of rooftop solar is the target, and we're nowhere there, at least in South Asia, right? So off-grid is a more interesting market. The economics work out, and this particularly in the Northeast and some regions of the central and southern states. The economics for off-grid solutions are very attractive, right? Because typically you're offsetting a kilowatt hour that's otherwise priced at about 25, 30, 35 cents. So off-grid solar, off-grid biogas, for example, community solutions like biogas, bioenergy become very attractive. And so there's been a reasonable degree of off-grid deployment, especially in the Northeast. In the hilly areas, Himachal, Uttaranchal, and then some areas that are outside the national grid.
No, just to add to that, the Cochin International Airport is now entirely off-grid. The entire airport operation is on solar. There are solar panels for everything. So, including the air traffic control, everything. So,
where I would sort of just add on is, so again, two contexts. In the off-grid situation, the economics are already very attractive. Just by moving to off-grid solar, distributed solar, or a community biogas system, you can probably shave off 10 to 12 cents of your conventional electricity charge. In the urban context, it's slightly different, right? You need policy subsidies, which is why the sector has taken off slowly. It's also true, though, like airports, stadiums, they've deployed solar extensively, but it's coming from an angle of securing their supply.
You don't want to
Yeah, so wherever blackouts are a big problem, and then you're dependent on diesel gensets. So wherever there is a need for diesel gensets, 30-40% of the time your weighted average cost is about 11 rupees per kilowatt hour. I don't know how much that is in cents. It's 50 to a Singapore dollar now, so it's about 1/5. So in that context, just to reduce the use of the diesel genset and secure your infrastructure, solar makes a lot of sense. But you also need areas with wide rooftops, which is why airports, large rooftops, airports and stadiums, commercial institutions, they are better fit in that sense.
Can I keep you online, Shiva, to ask, I mean, as you know, I work on China, and their success in boosting solar PV is very much linked to the joining of industrial policy with energy policy, i.e. we support the PV manufacturers, they drive the price down, they therefore provide low prices for us in China. To what extent is India following that model by supporting its own manufacturers of solar PV panels?
Yeah, so the economics of solar PV deployment in China are unclear because upstream there is some degree of capital subsidy that's happening. So it's difficult to say whether it's a market-driven deployment, or is it, we use the word sort of regulation or diktat earlier, so is it that? In India, the first 8 years until about 2016, 2017, most of the deployment happened with Chinese modules. So it was, I would say, 95, even 98% imported content going into Indian solar projects. In 2017, and it goes back to, I think, what Bhavya asked earlier, there was a 25% tariff imposed on imported modules. This is to protect the local Indian manufacturing industry. Having said that, even as of today, because of lack of scale, support, whatever you may call it, Indian manufactured content is at least one-third more expensive than Chinese content. Right? So the 25% import tariffs make costs somewhat comparable. But then there's also the ability to give long-term guarantees, warranties on panel performance, which the Indian manufacturers are perhaps too small to provide for project scales of 100, 200, 250 megawatts. So we still see substantial amount of import.
Of course, we still have to see the lifetime performance of the Chinese imports. I think we are getting into that kind of a problem that a lot of people are importing a lot of stuff from China and putting up solar panels. How they will perform over the long term, okay, immediately you get the subsidies, immediately you get the value, you get your money back in about 5 or 6 years. But whether they are really a long-term investment or not, I think it's still a question mark. We don't know, at least we don't know.
I agree, but if I'm a developer, one way to look at it is I don't need the modules to work well for 25 years. Because the deployment cost 10 years later is probably definitely going to be cheaper. So I need a module that works reasonably well for 8 or 10 years, and I'm happy to repower the system later. So that is probably affecting some level of decision making here.
Yes, sir, in the front row. Can we have the microphone up the front, please? Just coming.
Hi, my question is for Mr. Shiva. My name is Sundaram. It's quite gratifying to note that India has moved up so rapidly into coming up to almost about 60,000 megawatts of renewable, as opposed to about 200,000 megawatt of thermal. But the fact is, renewable cannot do without thermal in today's context, in the absence of storage systems. But when you have plans of moving up these renewables to 400,000 megawatt, are we clear of the track of where we are going to get this technology, and where are we as of today in terms of, without that it's not going to work? Because as it is, the thermal-based power plants are in great difficulty thanks to the new systems under which the energy is bought by the distributing companies. With the PLF at hardly around 50 to 51% nationwide, are we in for a big disaster in the power industry? With all the good intention of bringing in renewables, are we going to kill the other side, which is the thermal power plants?
It's a great question. In India, in the last decade or so, policy has favored renewables at the cost of the thermal industry. Right? We've seen stranded power assets struggling to even pay their interest costs. And even there's been a systematic bias. The government-owned thermal plants are doing slightly better than the private-owned thermal plants, which have not even managed to recoup operating costs. And this is happening because the discoms are favoring purchases from the government-owned thermal plants only because they can afford to pay later, whereas the private players would work on a 60 to 90-day cash cycle. So we are actually seeing the thermal power sector in a deep distress right now. I foresee a lot of pain. Now here's the thing, the thermal sector has to evolve dramatically, right? Even with change in the risk profile of renewable projects, we will continue to see accelerated deployment, regardless of where storage is going. This will need a different type of thermal sector in India, is my view. We'll need a thermal sector that's very agile and that can actually provide rapid reserve capacity. Now, what kind of thermal sector that is, I don't know, because natural gas landed prices in India are very, very expensive. So the Singapore option of having CCGT as a strong reserve capacity is not a very, very ideal solution. Right? So what kind of flexible thermal system will have to cope with the dramatic intermittency that the massive deployment of renewables is going to create is questionable. The expectation in India right now is that storage costs will dip, and they can use storage to balance the intermittency problem and to also balance out the discrepancies in the regions through a nationwide transmission grid so that imbalances in if you have a larger grid, you have a better way of dealing with imbalances. So the 300 to 500 gigawatt vision is currently based on a lot of hope and expectation that something magical will happen in the storage sector. That's my view right now.
And presumably, if you really do link into all this hydro from the north, then you can use that to balance out too.
Actually, I wouldn't take such a view for a simple reason. Because again, if you look at where solar capacity is getting created substantially, let's say it's getting created in Tamil Nadu, in Southern Maharashtra, in Rajasthan, in Madhya Pradesh, where the actual, I would say, rain days are less than 80 or 90 in a year, which means you have solar power availability for 260, 270 days in a year. And a lot of solar stations now no longer look towards storage. They look towards direct supply. When the generation happens out of the solar power set, it goes directly into the grid and directly gets supplied, which means that you have only to plan for those hours where solar power is not available. And if you're looking at 60 to 70 days, you're looking at 270 days availability. And in those 270 days, you are looking at only 8 hours non-availability. So if you are able to station generation capacity, whether thermal or gas or whatever it is, to back up. So you're getting into a totally different picture. Instead of thermal stations becoming baseload stations, thermal stations would become stations where there'd be non-available supply stations. And okay, I live in Tamil Nadu. I can see this happening. For 4 months, 5 months in the year, all the thermal stations actually back down and they take up their modernization, renovation, whatever, etc. Okay. The question is, what does it do to the balance sheet of the thermal stations? Terrible. Okay, they die. Because you have set up a thermal station on the expectation that it will be a baseload stations. And they are doing 50-55%. but you're not able to run it all through the year. Your plant load factor is low. Your generation capacity is low. So that's the stress which is coming. Okay. The flip side of it is you're getting power at 2.5 rupees. So okay, it's a social benefit that this is creating. I mean, there are no answers to this. There are no answers to whether it's a right choice or not. But you're getting cheaper power for a longer period of time at a cost of somebody who's put in a lot of money to set up a power plant. Right, wrong, I don't know actually.
Peter.
Yeah, just to add one angle, as you rightly say, there are no single answers to this question. But the other issue that needs to be looked at when it comes to regulations is this issue of hybridization, is that thermal need not operate alone. I mean, thermal plus renewables can work. And increasingly can then compete against energy storage solutions as well. So again, regulations need to allow for this concept of hybridized power so that there is not just a single solution, but potentially a solution of multi-technologies that will come up to an energy requirement in a single market. Again, today's policies and regulations do not allow for that to happen very easily, or the finance sector to finance those kind of hybrid operations. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done for stakeholders to move into that sort of framework of thinking.
Doesn't the capacity charge do that? I mean, if these coal stations were to be given a capacity payment for being available, that's how you would deal with it.
I would say it's partly capacity charge, but it's also partly to do with variable energy pricing, so taking into this issue of different multiple loads, peak load, mid load. It's how you actually create different pricing policies alongside that too as well.
Okay, we got to... Okay, yes, please, in the front. Please hang on, sir.
Taking off from where Mr. Narayan mentioned, we're really surprised to see the aggressive biddings that goes on for this solar tenders, where people are bidding at 2 rupees 30 paise to 2 rupees 50 paise in that band per unit. Is that sustainable on a long-term basis, sir?
So the 2 rupees 40 paise was for a few projects in Rajasthan. The average price is around 350, 375 right now. That perhaps is currently for the next 2 or 3 years the sustainable kilowatt hour wholesale kilowatt hour rate that these guys are sustainable at, financially sustainable at. This is assuming a debt cost of about 10%. Now, the project economics are very, very sensitive to the cost of debt. How policymakers are sort of sweetening the deal is, if you see the average project size or average tender awarded has steadily gone up in the last 10 years, right? So where you had 20 megawatt, 28, 30, 35 megawatt type of projects, these days you're seeing ticket sizes of 100 megawatt, especially in the big solar parks. So this allows it pushes consolidation, the bigger players survive, but it also allows them to borrow at scale and hopefully get a better interest rate. So 3 to 350 is perhaps the sustainable rate next 2 or 3 years before, again, something changes in the fundamentals and prices drop. Again, we are looking at about, because of a combination of the devaluation of the rupee plus a fall in prices, we are looking at about 750K per megawatt right now, and at a price of 350 per kilowatt hour. These are financially sustainable. Now, what is going to change, I believe, after the pain in the short term is that the risk profile of the projects is going to change. I don't believe that the guarantee of a fixed price for 15 years or 12 years is going to continue. Renewable developers will be forced to assume some kind of a market risk, depending on when they generate at the grid demand at that time. So time of use pricing policies will come in even for generators. So can they, we have a lot of data on solar right now on their generation profiles. Wind is very erratic. So it's very difficult to model any type of sort of predictive intelligence to assess when generation will happen and how much money it can generate for you. Solar is a bit more predictable right now because of more data, but we need to see how they can cope with newer risk profiles.
Okay, it's time to call an end to this panel, so please join me in thanking the panelists very much for a very instructive session. And I will now ask Dr. Narayan to present our two visitors with a copy of the book.
I would request Dr. Narayan to remain in the front here for the book launch. I would also like to now invite the other two editors of the book, titled Sustainable Energy Transition in South Asia, Challenges and Opportunities, to join Dr. S. Narayan for the book launch. They are Dr. Christopher Len, Senior Research Fellow and Head of Publications, ESI NUS, and Ms. Roshni Kapoor, Research Analyst, ISAS NUS.
Sure. Just a few quick words. This book is the result of a South Asia Energy Workshop and Conference, jointly organized by the two institutes in November 2017. The discussion panel we just heard covered a wide range of energy challenges and opportunities for the South Asian region. And these issues are also covered by the authors in this book. So I would encourage everybody to buy a copy. Right? And here I would like to thank the directors and colleagues from both institutes for their support in making this book project a success. And a big thank you to my fellow editors and the authors who contributed. It's been a real joy working with all of you. And finally, thank you to our publisher, World Scientific, especially the editor, Ms. Shreya Gopi, for the support and smooth production of this edited volume. I really appreciate the patience and professionalism of the publishers. Thank you very much. And now I will pass the mic to my fellow editor, Roshni.
Thank you, Dr. Len. So as he mentioned, that the book is an outcome of the ESI and the ISAS workshop and conference. I just want to thank my co-editors for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this very exciting and a very important project and working very closely to get the book published. It's my first edited book, and I've learned a lot from the process, from the copy editing, proofreading, and working closely with the publisher. It's been a very important learning curve. So we hope that the book is going to be a valuable contribution to the conversations on energy transition. And those who are keen to read the book, they can go outside and purchase a book at the World Scientific booth. There's a major discount going on right now of $40. So I'll pass the mic now to Dr. Narayan.
Thank you. Actually, in this, it's Christopher who has taken 80-90% of the load. So, I mean, I have to thank him because I've been in and out. I've not been here most of the time. And all the detailed work, including with the publishers and all that, he has worked with Roshni. He's taken on the load. So, I mean, from my part, really thank Christopher for all that he has done and Roshni. Thank you.
I would invite now the editors to launch their book on sustainable energy transition in South Asia, challenges and opportunities. Thank you, Dr. Narayan, Dr. Len, and Ms. Roshni. I invite Dr. Narayan and Ms. Roshni to take their seats off the floor. Yeah. And I now invite Dr. Len to deliver his closing remarks.
Yes, thank you very much. I will keep this short. At the opening remarks, Dr. Palit mentioned that this event is a continuation of our collaboration efforts between the two institutes, and we expect to have more such joint initiatives to come. On behalf of the Energy Studies Institute, I would like to say that it's really a pleasure always working with our ISAS colleagues. And also, thank you to our panelists today, Dr. Narayan, Mr. Shiva Sasela, Mr. Peter Godfrey, and also to the moderator, Dr. Philip Andrew Speed, for sharing the views and moderating this event. I think there were a lot of different issues that were raised, and I think these are all food for thought. It's a very important region, and we hope to be able to do more research in this area. And then also a note of thanks to my ESI and ISAS event colleagues, Ms. Jan Lui and also Jordan Ang and his team for their excellent work behind the scenes. So finally, thank you all of you for attending. Please have a look at the book, and also there's a coffee and tea waiting for you outside. Thank you very much.
Well done.